There are some justified reasons why we can go after information from our employees. For example, um, we might improperly be using information, or we might be improperly managing data, or we might be harassing people based on it. So there are some risks in gathering this data. So we want to make sure that we're not harassing people, we're not using that information improperly, and we're not poorly managing the data that we have. We are responsible for protecting people and to use the data that we have properly. But there are certainly justified reasons for it because we're trying to protect our assets. We're trying to protect the investment that we make. And if someone is stealing from us, or if someone is improperly using us and misrepresenting the company, we need to make sure that we can manage that messaging, right? There are a lot of new technologies out there and devices that enable us to gather and store data, and we want to raise questions about the ownership of who owns data, who owns devices. If it is an employer-owned device, it's very different than it was a employee-owned device. So we want to think about the impact of cloud storage, and if we're storing stuff in a cloud and it is that person's personal cloud storage, to make sure that they are not having spillover of their personal information on their work-related on the work-related devices. And a lot of companies have a bring your own device workplace. Again, we need to make sure we're very clear about what is considered private in the workplace and is protected and what is not protected. So the BYO device workplaces, have some concerns with protection and where the boundary conditions are. So employers have been monitoring employees forever. I mean, as long as people have been working, there has been monitoring going on. What's changed is how we monitor and the kinds of things that we monitor. Largely with technology, there's a lot of different changes that have occurred in terms of the way that we are engaging in monitoring of employees. So we have a rich history of monitoring employee lives. And rich, mm, I don't really like that term. It's sort of what's in the PowerPoint. I mean, we have a long history of it. I'm not sure that it's rich, and then I'm not sure that I like it, but I do recognize that employers do have the right to do some monitoring of their employees' lives when it impacts the bottom line of the organization. New technologies have increased the range of information that we can get and the power of the information that we have, which has some ethical implications. And certainly we have to address ethical. Legal, entirely different, but ethical is a whole separate animal. There are some new technologies that also raise possibilities for employee misconduct. The amount of cybersecurity that needs to occur because of the fact that people can cheat and steal money and embezzle and sell information. I mean, there's a lot of that out there. We have boundaryless workspaces. So there is a blur, particularly now under the pandemic, there's a blur between what is personal space and professional space, what is personal time and private time. When people are working out of home offices, what about the security in place to ensure those home offices are secure? So this was a big issue for the last year under the pandemic, particularly when we were working with organizations that were, when I was doing consulting with organizations that had people working remotely, and they wanted to make sure that their work was secure. And that is a big issue, right? How do we make sure that we keep government secrets a secret and private, when we are engaging in telecommunications and we're teleworking? Employee theft is still growing. There are still large numbers of people who are stealing from their company, whether it's what we call retail shrinkage, meaning people stealing items from their organization, even if it's white collar crimes such as stealing copy paper and pens and pencils and things like that, or whether it's actually stealing money and things of that nature, or stealing information and reselling it. Theft is a big issue, and public and private employers will be monitoring to manage that shrinkage or those problems. So what can you expect? Video monitoring is key. Obviously, video monitoring can be limited. We don't video monitor changing rooms. We're not allowed to do that because that's where we would expect a reasonable amount of privacy. Electronic device memory, global positioning software, GPSs. If you're using a company car that has a GPS on it, if you're using a company phone with a GPS on it, you can expect that the company is going to monitor that. If you're using your phone, not so much. Radio frequency identification devices, RFIDs. There are actually people that there are companies that are allowing chips to be put underneath people's skin so that they can scan in and get into secure places because they have the chip on them. Now, we're not talking about, get the COVID vaccine and get a Microsoft chip in your vaccination, because that's kind of not what's happening, to be real. But RFID, are the radio frequency ID identification things, can go on ID identification cards. It can go underneath your skin. There's a whole load of places where we see RFIDs being used. Biometrics, where people can scan your retina, which has a unique print, just like a handprint does, and your fingerprints. It's unique to every individual, the iris scanning. So there's all sorts of biometric technology. If you're using your iPhone, most of us are using and are very used to facial recognition software that you swipe up and it recognizes our face and it allows us to open. And even if you don't have a new device, if you had an older device and you put your thumb on the home button, that home button could read your thumbprint and it knew who you were, and it enabled you then to be able to access your phone. um, Big data collection, using big data and analyzing big data. That's also a growing trend right now in terms of how do we manage the data that we collect of our customers and our clients, and how do we use that data then to be able to make decisions in the organization. So Exhibit 1410, it's in the textbook. What do employers monitor? They monitor your social networking. They monitor your work on the blogosphere. They're looking at your computer files, what you store and what you review. They're looking at the keystrokes that you make if you're working on a computer. So if you're supposed to be doing productive work on a computer and that's what your job is, they're going to monitor your keystrokes. They're also monitoring your internet connection. So they can't monitor your computer, but they can monitor the use of the internet when you're using company computers. If you're using your computer, bring your own device, totally separate issue. But the fact that you can use your own computer, you use a company computer, there is no presumption of privacy when you're using company equipment. Exhibit 1411 also talks about the implications of new technology. What are some of the advantages, right? Number one, we can monitor usage. Number two, we're managing employee-employer expectations. So we may have different expectations because our technology will enable us to monitor things differently. Distinguishing between work use and personal use in technology. So we have to consider when the work is being done and when personal use of the computer is being done. So, managing that. Managing flex time, and when can people be on the job and when not. Managing the virtual workplace, protecting against medical concerns for telecommuters, managing and balancing privacy issues. When is it okay to be screening and looking and monitoring employees, and when is it not? Monitoring the use of the web, that's where we're spreading information and spreading misinformation. Managing what we consider to be fair use and disclosure about stuff. Just responding to accessibility related issues when it comes to the digital divide. So how do we make sure that everybody has access, right, to technology? Managing temporary workforces, and do we allow them to have use of technology? Adapting to stress and changing systems. Maintaining proprietary information and how important it is. The recipe for Kentucky Fried Chicken, the recipe for Coca-Cola, and whatever proprietary information is unique to your company that gives you a competitive advantage, that has to be protected. Measuring performance. We can measure performance through technology. We can measure, how long you sit in your chair, how many keystrokes you make, how many breaks you take when you're not in front of your computer because it's monitoring you. you would be amazed at the level of monitoring that can be done by technology in these days. And of course, we're trying to think about liability issues and how important it is for us to manage liability issues. So what do we know about this evolving legal environment? There are statutes and cases that are just beginning to address employer monitoring issues. The City of Ontario versus Kwan is a big one. It's trying to balance the reasonable expectation of privacy and good business related justification of the employer's interests. And so again, where does that line get drawn? And that City of Ontario versus Kwan is absolutely a state level case. We don't have anything that has gone up to the Supreme Court level at this point in time. That doesn't mean it won't happen, but certainly we haven't seen any cases that have needed to go up to the Supreme Court level with respect to privacy. But I would expect probably before the next edition of this textbook goes out that we're going to see some challenges to some of these cases. If you have a policy regarding monitoring, it can impact the employee's expectation of privacy. So being clear and straightforward about what is being monitored and what is not being monitored and doing that properly, making sure that when you are monitoring that you're following through, that you're using the proper policies in place so that people are aware of the guidelines and the expectations if they do not behave properly while they're being monitored. But it's also important, right, as we've talked about initially, that if we're going to monitor somebody, that we're clear how we're using that information and why we're using that information, and we cannot use it for different purposes. So the business justifications for monitoring employees are pretty straightforward. Employers are particularly concerned about productivity and lost time with people surfing online. So we know that it can be, you could get into the, the cycle of surfing a web and playing a game, and suddenly you've lost hours of productivity, which is problematic. So employers can limit your use of time on the internet with games and things like that. Now, you bring your own phone to work. They can't stop you from playing games on your phone, but they can stop you at least from using, the company computer from doing that. Protecting against liability. Someone, again, making mistakes or doing things that would put the company at risk. And we can monitor to make sure that employees are not engaging in poor behaviors that can put the company at risk. The inappropriateness of use of web software, which can create viruses and other hacks and other infringement issues. And so again, using certain web-based software, we need to protect the company from any potential cybersecurity risks and other inappropriate materials, the not safe for work stuff, porn and other things that can be an issue at a workplace, because that also puts us at a liability, not just for cybersecurity problems, but also for sexual harassment problems and workplace hostile working environment issues. It's very important for every employer to come up with a very clear internet use policies. There are some companies that lock everything down. You can only use it for work-related issues, and they monitor that. There are other companies that give people wide berth, that create an environment of trust. And every company is going to be different. It just depends on the company culture and what to expect. And if you want a culture where there's trust, then you need to make sure you're clear about your policy and then let people do what they need to do and follow through punishing people who engage inappropriately in behaviors. If you set rules and regulations up and people engage in it, then in the bad behaviors, then they should be punished, period. So the consistency with which you address these problems, as well as the consistency of your policy, creates the culture that you're looking